So, thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody. Fabulous turnout. We really appreciate the time and energy. We know it's the end of a long day for many of you. I should preface this by saying, as a longtime Sloan faculty member, it's really hard for me to talk sitting down. I'm kind of used to wandering around here. I'm going to do my best, but if I get up, I apologize. Please don't take it. So, as head of the Leadership Center, one of the things that I have definitely learned in the last 2 years is, although we teach a variety of fabulous frameworks in our classes to think about leadership as a topic and a set of skills, there is absolutely no substitute for experience. And sessions like this one, I think, are incredibly helpful for all of us to take some of the academic ideas from class and turn it into hopefully practical skills and strategies that you can take back to whatever career that you might follow when you leave Sloan. As a consequence, we have two very experienced leaders here with us this evening, and there's probably a variety of topics that we could talk about. But given that we have a very rare entity and an incredibly successful dual career family, we thought that we would focus our attention on that, because it's not that many opportunities that at least we get to talk to a couple that's had such a distinguished career on sort of both sides. And so tonight our goal is really to dig into two questions. The first question is really to think about, for all of us as leaders, how do you balance the very difficult competing demands of being, hopefully for all of you, senior leaders in important organizations, but also supportive spouses and partners and parents, sort of the famous sort of work-life balance that is talked about all the time. But also, as you know, there's lots of literature out there that suggests that the world is not yet, despite our best intentions, a fair place when it comes particularly to gender. And if you look at the survey data, women think very differently about the responsibilities they're going to have with children than men might, despite the fact that we might all desire a more equitable distribution. So the second question tonight, really, for all of us is, as you move into more senior positions, what are things that you can do to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem? So hopefully we'll reserve a little bit of the time at the end to talk about different ways that you all can make a difference. Okay? Now, I imagine for those of you that are in our MBA program, that first question is a little bit more relevant to you since you're kind of on the cusp of your careers. For some of the mid-career folks, you're probably in a little bit different route, so we'll try to hit both of those. I'm going to ask a few questions to get us started, but then we will pretty quickly turn it over to your questions, so start thinking about some of the things that you might want to know as we go forward. Okay? So to get started, I'm going to turn to Ilene. You're a Sloanie, so welcome. And particularly for our MBA students, help us frame the challenges that they're going to face moving forward as they move into senior roles, think about having spouses and families as they go forward.
Great. Well, thank you, and great to be here after so many years. And I must say that I'm very happy that this is I call a balanced audience, men and women. And I'm very competitive. So Bram, who went to Columbia, we were there about 10 days ago, and this audience is 2 to 3x what was there. So we had a side bet, so thank you.
But she wins not only on size, but also on diversity. So
Okay.
The Columbia folks have some things to do.
Yeah, we'll tell them. And we're connected because we were both non-Harvard, so we met at BCG.
I think that's worth a round of applause.
Yeah. But anyway, I love to frame this topic because having been a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and I've met Sheryl Sandberg. She talks a lot about women need to lean in. Okay, we can talk about that. Companies need to do their part. Okay. But it's all about, I think it's all about the career, the couple. So what I want to start off and just frame it and say, how many of you expect to be you either are or you expect to be in a dual career situation? So please raise your hand. Okay, that's what I expected, thank you. Now, for the men only, how many of you expect that you might have to move or make some type of compromise for your spouse's career? Okay, excellent. That's what we're going to talk about. How do you make those decisions as a couple? And you say that you are planning to, and I really hope that it happens that way. But I can tell you that it doesn't always happen in the real world. And we'll talk about the lessons learned. Bram's been a great spouse. We've raised 2 wonderful kids. We have 2 grandkids. But I can tell you that when your spouse comes home and says, I have to be at a meeting next week, Tuesday night, and you already had a meeting, and you roll your eyes, you will have violated the supportiveness. So we'll talk about what it really means. It's going to be very hard. And one of the lessons that we learned, because we want you all to be very successful. So that's what we're doing. We're imparting our lessons learned, keys to success, and how to make it happen.
Great. Thank you. So let's start with a little context from each of you, just for the audience to get a sense of both of your career trajectories. So I'll start with Bram, and then we'll move to Ilene. Just give us a little sense of the sort of major milestones in your career.
Okay, so to start off, I went to a liberal arts and engineering school called Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania. When I went to Lafayette, it was an all-male school. I had a ROTC obligation when I graduated. I graduated at 20, and there was a little war going on in Southeast Asia, so I opted to try and go to business school, and I was very lucky to be admitted to Columbia Business School because I was 20 years old and I didn't have any work experience. When I graduated Columbia Business School, I went into the U.S. Army. I spent a fair amount of time when I was at Columbia in the computer center, doing multivariate statistical analysis of consumer behavior data. So I was able, after going through the field artillery school, to talk my way into, after going through Officer Basic, to talk my way into the field artillery school. And I actually designed computer systems for the U.S. Army at the field artillery school on some of the early IBM machines. When I was discharged from the Army, I was looking for my first job, and a couple of my professors at Columbia Business School recommended me to a job at the Federal Trade Commission in Washington. I was recommended to a commissioner, one of 5 commissioners, and she was very keen to look at portfolio allocation models at the FTC and look at effectiveness of different programs. And she was looking for a non-legal MBA type to do that. And I was very lucky to work for a very, very brilliant lawyer by the name of Mary Gardner Jones. And it was my first experience with a strong woman professional. After working at the FTC, I joined a small little consulting firm called the Boston Consulting Group. In those days, we were very small. We only had 1 office here in the United States. We had a couple in Europe, 1 in Japan. I spent 7.5 years at BCG. After I was in Boston, I went to South Africa for a year. I came back from South Africa, moved to London with Ilene, then from London, we moved to Chicago. So I spent 7.5 years at BCG, and then in 1980, I became a partner of Booz Allen Hamilton, at the time the largest management consulting firm, because it had a government business and a commercial business, and spent over 25 years as a partner of first Booz Allen Hamilton, then A.T. Kearney for 17 years, and then I went back to Booz Allen for 5 years as a senior partner. So I am a career consultant. I love the hunt. I love to solve the problem. I love convincing people to think differently about their businesses. And I have 8 million miles on this body. So that tells you a little bit about our work-life challenge. I met Ilene when I got back from South Africa. They were making a bet as to how quickly the 2 of us would get together. And those who bet under 30 days won. So we were quickly an item and then moved off to London. And we just celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary 2 days ago. So, so we hope tonight, thank you very much for listening to us. We hope tonight we do bring a little bit of practical advice to the table. So,
okay. Well, most of you know my background, that I was an undergrad at MIT in mathematics, course 18, and then I stayed on at Sloan. And in those days, it was an MS in management. We had to write a thesis. There was no MBA. I then joined BCG, and that's where I met Bram, as he just told you. And I was in the office, the Boston office, the London office, and then opened the Chicago office. We then were married, so I realized that 2 consultants in the same family was challenging. We'll talk about that. We have a 5-year age difference, which helped. So then I joined the corporate world. And I then spent 25 years in the packaging industry and running larger and larger businesses. And I moved from a company called Packaging Corporation of America, and I worked for the French company Pechennet, when I ran the flexible packaging business. And I tell people that I went to Paris every month for 10 years, which sounds great, but it was grueling. I was based the last 3 years in Paris. My family was back in Chicago, but my kids were getting ready for college then. I was then recruited to run a publicly traded food ingredients company that had the same customers as the packaging companies. So it was value-added food ingredients. The company was called Corn Products, based in Chicago. So I actually got to sleep in my own bed, but I still was traveling all the time. We were creating food ingredients in 40 countries. So I had to travel quite a bit. I know a lot about the cultures of those 40 countries. We rebranded the company Ingredion when Corn Products bought a company called National Starch. And the joke of the first 24 hours of the teams was, what's the name of the new company? Corn Products, National Starch. Are you going to call us Cornstarch? It was a joke, but I listened, and it meant we needed a new identity, and neither company wanted the other's name, and neither one was an exciting name. So we rebranded the company, and as a result of putting a healthy company ingredients together with Corn Products' great balance sheet, and rebranding the company, we more than quadrupled the market cap, the stock price. So at the end of my 9 years of being CEO, really created a lot of value. We did this, and we'll talk a lot about, we raised 2 kids. We had a lot of live-in nannies. I'm a big proponent of live-in nannies because Bram was traveling all the time. Everybody lives in Chicago now. One of my children, they're both in their 30s. My son has 2 children, so we have 2 grandchildren. And I've had the opportunity to join a lot of corporate boards. So I've actually been on 8 different boards. I was the first woman on 5 of them. And it's all about creating value. So now I sit on 2 publicly traded boards, International Paper, a global packaging company, paper and packaging, and Lockheed Martin, defense, a lot of MIT people there. And it's always about how you create value on those boards. So we can talk a little bit about that. But it's been a fun career, and now I've just entered that, Bram calls it rewiring or retiring, and it's a whole new chapter. We had a 65 retirement age at Corn Products Ingredion, and my successor was ready. So I mentored him, and then I stepped aside, and now I'm having a lot of fun and giving speeches, so this is fun.
Well, we are definitely the beneficiaries. So let's start with a couple of the pieces of practical advice. I know from our previous discussions you've got a variety of lessons that have been learned from your lives together. Let's start with the first one that you mentioned to us, which was marry a supportive partner who will support both careers. It sounds pretty easy to say, but I'm guessing putting that into practice is a little bit more challenging. So what does that mean to both of you?
You want to start?
So look, when you marry a supportive partner, having a supportive partner is a key ingredient to any successful career, regardless of what the spouse does. What we were able to do is we were able to marry a supportive partner and also have 2 careers in the house. And you know what that means is that you have to be successful in your own career, and you have to be successful in supporting your spouse in their career. And you also have to find time to support your family. So you have a lot of people that you have to support. So you have to quickly learn that it's not all about you, but it's all about the people that are part of your network that you're supporting. And there are some decision rules. I mean, you have to find somebody who's going to support your career the way you want it to be. And we'll come back and talk a little bit more about it. But a supportive spouse is, Ilene found time, despite everything she told you she did, to make me feel like she was supporting my career. And by virtue of the fact that I'm still sitting here after 40 years, I must have done the same thing for her.
Well, we'll talk a lot about our lessons learned, but one of the ones to be a supportive spouse, as an example, Bram would go to partner meetings, and they would hold them on weekends. And so we either had to have a backup nanny or some type of support system for the kids, but we put into place what's called the Saturday night rule. And I said, you know what, if he's gonna be in another city Saturday night and he has to go to a meeting, I'm gonna support him, I'm gonna fly there and be with him. Now it sounds crazy, but they went to good places. So I remember one year, they were in Colorado Springs. So I said, you know what, I need a day to myself. I'll fly to Phoenix, I'll spend the day there, and I'll fly that afternoon, and I'll see him on Saturday night in Colorado Springs. So I remember going to a meeting once. So it was a lot of energy, but I made it happen. And so I walked in, and he encouraged me. So I walked into that, and his friends looked at, like, what's your spouse doing here? I didn't know spouses were invited. He's like, they're not. She paid for it, and she's here, and she's sleeping in my room. And so that was the part of the support. To make the calendar work for his partner meetings. I remember going to some partner meetings, very pregnant, and I said, you know, we'll just figure it out. Let's call that our spring break. We'll leave the kids at home, and we'll be together, and we'll then end up we'll go away alone, and then we'll end up at the meeting. So it meant planning and organizing and using skills, but to always be there. So I love to tell people that we've been married 40 years. The number of Saturday nights that we've been apart, it's less than 10. And people would say to me, we need you in Asia Monday morning. I'd say, sorry, that means leaving Saturday night. You all know the schedule, you lose a day. So I'd say, you know what, I will be there for Tuesday morning. And because otherwise I have to leave Saturday night and I won't get to see my spouse. And so, or I knew the schedule so that I could get there for Monday night dinner. If you go through Frankfurt, went the other way. So you figure that out, but it does take a lot of energy, whereas some of my partners, my colleagues would say, oh yeah, I'll be there Monday morning, you know, and they would never say no, and I'd say, no, I'm not gonna do that. So that was part of being supportive, is bending my schedule to be there for Saturday night.
Great. So in the discussion we had getting ready, Bram, one of the things you mentioned was that every time there was friction between the two of you, the result was a rule, and a rule to help manage work-life balance. And you've already given us an example, Ilene, with the Saturday night rule. But I'm sure we would all benefit, maybe starting with Ilene this time. What were some of the other rules that you used to kind of bound the problem and make sure that the balance didn't get too far out of whack?
Well, one of my favorite rules was we came up with this thing called the 48-hour rule. And I've tried this out on a lot of people. It really resonates. As a consultant, you know that you're susceptible to what the client wants. So he would come home Friday night, let's say at 8 p.m. from a client assignment. And he'd say, you know what, I have to be in Ohio at 8 a.m. on Monday. I said, well, that means leaving Sunday at 4 p.m. You need to be home for 48 hours. And so we agreed on 48 hours. And I said, what that means is, I realize you can't get home till Friday night at 8. Will you please call your client and say you can't make the 8 o'clock meeting, but you could make 10 o'clock, because you would take the 6 a.m. to Detroit. And so Bram would call the client or send him a note. We didn't have email in those days. And he would say, listen, I want to be a good spouse and a good family person. And we actually would have a family meeting every Sunday night. We would go over our schedule. And he'd say to the client, you know what, I can't be there till 10. And if I want to, it's good for the relationship. Do you have a problem? 100% of the time, the client said, that's great. We'll have the meeting at 10. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, you know, and what happens is that most of the time your clients or the people who are calling the meeting are family people. And if they work in a large corporation, family is important in a corporation. And if you're in a service business, you have a tendency sometimes to de-emphasize that. But what we learned over time is that if we set boundaries, like a 48-hour rule, we would be able to push back and say, well, I understand you want me there at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, but if I come, I'm probably going to be grouchy all week. And he'd say, why is that? Tell me what. Well, it's just one meeting, Bram. It's only an hour. I said, that's exactly the point. It's only one meeting. It's 8 to 9. And if you did it from 10 to 11, I would be home all weekend, and I'd have a much happier house, and I'd be a happier person for the entire week. And they would say, oh, well, why didn't you just ask me to push it back an hour? I can rearrange some things. And by and large, when you have rules, if you're firm in describing what the rule is and why you put in place that rule, your clients will respect that. And that's one of the lessons that we learned. And it got created because obviously I was allowing clients to encroach in my family life, and I justifiably pushed back and said, no, we have to have some boundary conditions here so that, 5 days doesn't become 7 days, and one weekend doesn't become every weekend, and all of a sudden you burn out in consulting when that happens. So.
Now, I was a big
was good.
believer also of what I call outsourcing non-value-added activities. So a lot of people say, oh, well, you need the spouse to split the housework. No, you don't. Neither of you should be doing that. You can hire people that will add value to their life. So we would hire people to do housework, but we would hire a nanny. But here's the thing, and I was a big believer in live-in nannies because I didn't want to have to be home at 6 at night. And it's true, you give up space. So you have to be in a city that works for space. But people say to me, well, I didn't want to live in nanny. I didn't want somebody under my roof. I'm like, well, you got to give up something. So we would have a live-in nanny. We first had a live-in nanny for 7 days a week. I hated it because she'd work Monday through Friday. She'd be around Saturday, Sunday, not working, but she'd be there. So it'd be awkward. So then we ended up hiring a nanny Monday through Friday whose brother lived in town, and she'd go home every weekend, and they'd be together, and it worked so much better. So you have to figure out the right situation, but outsourcing, and we were the parents. I mean, we were the parents of the weekend. I love to tell people the story that we had the live-in nanny during the week, so we would be running around, and then when the kids were little, we were home on weekends with the kids, and we were the parents, but then when we had two, it was a lot of energy, so we actually hired a second shift. I said, Bram, why don't we? So we actually hired a high school girl. I like to tell you the story that this kind of dates us, but in Chicago they had a home for unwed mothers that the farmers would send their daughters who were pregnant. I'd call up every Monday morning and I'd say to the house mother, send me somebody over. I'm going to teach her how to take care of the kids. And we would get our babysitting from Friday night to Sunday morning, and it was a win-win. And so she would make some money, she would learn. So that was an outsourced activity, but we still were in charge of the family and making those decisions. But it wasn't the norm to have a second shift.
Yeah, so there's another rule that I live by, and that is, and it works for both spouses, and that is never arrive home to a cold house. Whenever you come home from a trip, make sure that you're walking into a warm house. And what do I mean by that? So, when I first started traveling quite a bit, I would come home and I'd say to Ilene, hi, I'm home. And she'd say, now that you've gotten to know her a little bit, you could relate to this. She'd say, I see that. And that's what happens when you walk into a cold house. And I deserved every bit of that. And I will tell you that that's going to happen to either, if you're a female traveling and you come home to a cold house, you're going to get the same reaction as I got when I came home. So anyway, I figured out I'm going to come home to a warm house. And what do I mean by that? And that is when I get off the phone, I get off the plane, I make the most urgent phone calls that have to be made. I make them as brief as I can so that by the time I get to my car, I can dial up Ilene and say, hi, how are you? I'm leaving the airport. And I begin to talk to her about what I missed since the last time we talked, which could be a couple hours, it could be a day, and rarely would it be longer than a day, but there would still be stuff to talk about. And then as I came to the house, I would drive as quietly as I could up the driveway so she couldn't hear me. And then she'd ask me one more question, and I'd say, do you mind if I come inside and answer that question? And she would laugh and say, oh, of course. And so I'd walk into a warm house. And then we would start our weekends. And then we would start being parents because we had another rule, which was we'd only have one set of parents at a time. And we were the parents for the weekend. And so we knew what our obligations were. And that meant we had to tell people at work we couldn't do some things on the weekend because we were, really parents for the weekend rather than available for the weekend. So those are how wills helped us.
This is great. So one of the other things that you were quite articulate about was the importance of advocating for each other and celebrating each other's success. And if I might ask you to start, Bram, tell us about Mr. Gordon.
So, you all heard that my name is Bram Bluestein. That's my legal name, but I have a second personality. And my second personality is Mr. Gordon, and I love him as much as I love Mr. Bluestein. And that's because Mr. Gordon is when I'm in the role of supporting Ilene, rather than promoting my own career. So I went to my first leadership meeting with Ilene, and here I am. I'm a new partner of a management consulting firm. I have my IBM laptop, and I'm able to do emails for the first time. And boy, I'm thinking I'm going to be at this meeting, and boy, I'm going to power up when they go off to their leadership meeting, and I'm going to shoot out emails. And we go to dinner, and her boss is a really strong leader, and he pulls me aside and he says, Bram, do you know why you're here tonight? And I said, Monty, why am I here tonight? And he said, you're here to support her. And I realized that I wasn't there to be shooting out emails on my own behalf. I was really there to be Mr. Gordon. So the next morning, instead of sending out emails, I went pottery shopping with all the women because that's what spouses did. And I continue to do when I go to events that are Ilene events. I do what the spouses do because that's what we do. And Mr. When I have to do it, I tell people at the office I have to be Mr. Gordon tonight, and they immediately understand that that's just an obligation that I have because I'm a part of a two-career couple.
So, it's interesting that we were doing this interview in Chicago, and the person who was interviewing us, I hate to say he was a McKinsey partner, because we're BCG, but he was ex-McKinsey, and he said, when I heard about that supporting the spouse, he put it into real terms where he and his spouse were both academics. And he said, I had a commitment, but I just heard from my spouse that she's being honored. So he said, I canceled my commitment for my career to be there for her because of what you said. And so that's the point, which is there are going to be trade-offs, but you have to be there to support the other person, and you have to decide, is what you were going to do more important or less important? You got to be there and make those trade-offs. So I love to tell the story, and Bram reminds me that in Chicago we have this thing called the Economic Club where there's speeches. And I would go to it, and he'd be traveling, and I would meet a lot of people who knew Bram. They'd say, oh, where's Bram? And I would come home and say, I just saw all your friends. And I'd say to them, oh, he's on a really important assignment, and he's in Detroit, or he's doing this or that. And he loved it when I came home and would say to him, I saw all your people who knew you, all your friends, but they realized that you're on a very important assignment, and that's why you're not here. Because in a way, they were almost not lamenting that he wasn't there, but they didn't quite understand it. It was an important event with speeches, but he was with the client. So I was supporting him even though, and advocating for his career even though he wasn't there. So there's a lot of ways to advocate for the other person's career, but it's making those trade-offs in your own priorities to be there. But you have to believe that it's a two-way street. And it's no longer, the female spouse supporting the male spouse, because you want it to be a quid pro quo for both sides. And so we practiced that very well. And I think it was 50-50. I mean, I never felt like I was over supporting you or you was over supporting me. It was very even.
So maybe one more question for me, and then I'm sure the audience has many. Let's just go to the second question I teed up quickly, which is, and we'll start with you, Ilene. Tell us a little bit about things you've done in your role as a chief executive officer and in other senior roles to make this trade-off a little bit easier or palatable for others that you've mentored or developed through the course of your career.
Well, you know, I've always been, as a leader of a corporation, a big proponent of diversity. So in my company, I actually put in, I use this rule, I put in a rule. And the new rule was, for every open position, there had to be a diverse slate, and it had to be real, and we were going to measure it. We actually first started like director and above, and then we went to lower levels. And we measured it for every department, every division, and then I'd ask for the numbers. And we would, and if you didn't make progress, you weren't doing your job. And that gave a lot of opportunity for people in other roles. So I was supporting that. The same thing is true when I sit on boards. I say, you know, we ought to have a goal of, I don't know, 30% diversity on this board. And diversity, again, you can define, it's not just gender, it can be cultural, it can be people of color. But you got to set goals. And so anything that I participate in, I always set the goals that we need to make improvement process. And it depends on the culture and how you implement that. And so I don't just dictate to the CEO and the boards that I'm on, but I do a big nudge in terms of helping, how do we get there? So that's how you build on diversity. In my role as a CEO, though, I used to do things that people did for me. As an example, on Halloween, I had a rule, which is no meetings after 4 p.m. Why? I wanted the men and women of our company who had young kids to go home and go trick-or-treating with their kids for safety. I was a big proponent of safety. And so by putting that rule in, people did it for me. They're like, I want you to go home trick-or-treating with your kids. So on October 31st, that was my rule, no meetings after 4 p.m. And people loved that. They really respected it. Another way I did that, I'll give you an example. By the time my kids were out of college and working, I'd say, you know what, we're going to take a spring break. As a CEO, I needed a week off every 8 weeks. That was the way I ran my life. So I'd say, we're going to take a spring break. And my kids would say, why are you calling it spring break? And I said, well, we're going to take it when everybody in our town is gone with their kids, because I don't want to call meetings that they feel like they have to be there for. And the spouses would really love it. So if it was the third week of March for suburban Chicago, that's when I took my spring break, because they then took theirs, they thanked me for it, and even though they might be staying late in February for an 8 o'clock meeting, they knew that the family would be together in spring break. So these are the ways that it was my way to show that I'm going to be supportive as a leader. And then, of course, people in the different divisions would take my lead, I would hope, in creating the same type of environment. But it really was very supportive. Now, a lot of people have said to me, when you're early in your career, you know, can you push back? Well, it's hard. So you need an environment that is upbeat and open towards diversity and will support it. But you have to be willing to speak out. And I can tell you, there's no CEO that will take you on if you say, look, I'm going to spring break with my family next week, so I can't make that meeting. I'll call in if you want. I will tell you that 9 times out of 10, the CEO will say, don't call in. Or you can call in, but you can be on mute. But you have to be willing to speak out. So you have to know yourself and be with your spouse, and you can't shirk it and say, well, I can't do that because there's a big meeting. I can't go away. I'm going to leave the family after 3 days. So it's very important that you be a leader of your own peers.
Anything to add to that, Bram?
No, I would just say in a consulting environment, the way in which you affect diversity is in the way you structure your teams, the way you listen to different team members, and how you make sure that you do that on an equal basis. And I was known as somebody who was all about the team. I was also known as somebody who didn't, spend my weekends on guys' trips, or, there were some practices 15 years ago which were more sexist, and I didn't participate in those things. So, people knew that as a leader, you were leading with a level playing field. And that's how I would say, in a professional services firm, you affect diversity. And obviously in the recruiting process and the evaluation process.
Fabulous. So let's open it up to all of you. I'm sure we've got more than enough questions to fill the remaining time. Yep, go ahead, right here.
So you guys mentioned being parents on the weekends, and I'm just curious, did you ever feel like you missed out on part of your kids growing up by virtue of only being parents on the weekends? Or could you clarify that rule more?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the question's about being parents during the week and not just on weekends. And we were totally focused on the weekends, but I will tell you, during the week, we were very involved. I mean, our kids always knew we were parents, so I love to tell the story, this has been written up, is that my daughter, who's now in her 30s, she used to want me to give her the spelling test, not the nanny. So I used to make a copy of the words before I would travel. And I remember once I was in Houston, and I was at a business meeting, and then I was in a cab going to a dinner meeting. And I said to my daughter, I will call you at 6 p.m., and I'm going to give you that spelling test. So I called her up, she put the words down, and I was giving her the test, and she was getting ready for this. And at the end, the taxi driver turned around and said to me, oh my God, you're mothering from the back of a taxi. This is before FaceTime and all of that. But the point was that I wanted to be there for her, and I wasn't in the same room, but I still was able to instill my values on what she was doing. And so there's lots of examples like that. So yeah, there are some trade-offs, but we made it work. We said we'll give you a spelling test, or we'll help you with that homework assignment, or we're going to be calling before you go to bed. I hated to get on an airplane that didn't have telephones because I couldn't make the phone call. You have something you want to
Well, no, I just want to ask Ilene a question if I'm allowed to do that.
I'll let it slide.
Okay, so my question is, of the days that you were in Chicago, how many days didn't you drive the kids to school?
Yeah, well, that was another one of my rules. So he knew this, that my goal was to drive them to school. So if somebody called an 8 o'clock meeting, I'd say, sorry, I will be there at 8:30. I have to drop off my kids at 8. So we moved.
Right.
We moved our house.
Right.
So I could do that. I mean, I couldn't drive 40 minutes.
Right. So the point I want to make in answer to your question is we've articulated these rules in very stark terms. But clearly our presence in the house during the week was very important, and it would ebb and flow. And so in my case, there's a period in my career when I was really involved in Detroit. And I used to go to Detroit by plane 2 or 3 times a week. I'd leave Monday morning at 6 a.m. I'd come home Tuesday night at 5 o'clock. I'd have dinner with the family if I could, or with Ilene. I'd go back Wednesday morning. I ran the Detroit office at that time. So I not only had client work, but also administrative responsibilities. Went back Wednesday morning till Thursday night, and if I had to, I'd go back Friday morning. And I did that every week because that's I was going to have a presence in the house. I was going to be a father. You just learn how to, get by with a little less sleep, which the first training exercise you have in that is when you have your first child.
But it's interesting, and so so that's why we say pick a great partner who's going to support all that. And if you have people around you, I had parents. My father was saying, go, yes, go for it. My mother was actually saying, like, can you really do this? You're going to leave them with a stranger? And I'd say, yep, I'm going to be there. And you know what? They knew, they to this day, they call us, all times of the day. They want to be home with us. They want to be with us. So there were trade-offs, but my kids, they really adapted to it. When I was commuting to Paris, I was afraid that one day they might be left on the street corner because the nanny couldn't get there in time. So we gave both kids a credit card and said, this is for an emergency only. This is before Uber. We said, one day you're going to be all alone on a corner. You need a credit card. And you know what? They were very respectful, and they never misused it. And if they needed it because they were stranded, they would use it. So there were benefits, there's trade-offs. But to this day, if you ask our kids, they were very supportive of what we were doing. They never felt like we weren't there.
Jihi?
I'm curious, Ilene, especially to you, did you know that Bram will be that supportive, like when you first met him and you're
You know, it's interesting. A lot of people have asked that. And so first of all, I'm big on, we have a 5-year age difference, 3 to 5. We were never competitive. He was always a manager in consulting before I was a lowly consultant. He was ahead always in his career. I knew, we met at work, we met at BCG. So we never talked about it, but it was kind of implicit that he would be supportive, that we were going through this journey of clients and delivering value. But I wasn't sure, but I knew that he felt very positive about women in his life. So one day he was on the phone, he's like, sweetheart, I'll be there soon. I'm thinking, does he have another girlfriend? It turned out it was his mother. I'm like, this is a guy who treats his mother well. He had a strong sister who had to pass judgment on me before we were an item. My sister too. We later realized that he had a female boss. So I knew that he would be very supportive in that way. But even when we had our kids, I took 3 months off with my daughter. I took 1 month off with my son. And he was like, yeah, go back when you're ready, when you want to make it happen. But go back. We'll be here. We'll figure it out. I remember once when they called me from Paris, and I was doing the back and forth, running the Americas, and they said, well, we need you to run all of global packaging, and we need you to run it. We need your decision tomorrow. Well, this was a Saturday they called me, and we want to announce it on Monday. And I said, well, I went and said, Bram, what do? I can't do that. How do I figure that out? He said, just say yes. You'll figure it out later. And so it took a few days, but I ended up saying yes pretty quickly, and they figured it out and they adapted to it. But he was always, every time, once they asked me to commute to Houston, I said, how am I going to do that? I don't want to leave my line job. I'm running the Northwest. I was a corrugated area manager. I mean, this was heaven. And they said, no, we need you in Houston to run all of operations from a staff point of view. And I went to Bram and I said, what do I do? I don't want to do that. He's like, you ought to do that. It's great for your career, and we'll figure out the Houston commute. So every Sunday night, we'd go to bed, all of us at 9 o'clock. I'd have to get up at 4 a.m. This was Tenneco. They'd send a plane to pick me up. A taxi was waiting at 4:30 in the morning. And Bram was there, and he's like, we'll figure it out. I'll be there.
Now, the interesting question is, would I have known 40 years ago that I was going to be that supportive? And the answer to that was, there was really no way to know. Except what I've learned over 40 years is that even when I get these great accolades, I never once felt like I gave up something in my own career. And in my own career, I was a partner for 25 years. I was the first non-management director elected by my partners. They actually, I ran the largest account team. I ran largest industry practice. I mean, I had phenomenal success as a management consultant, but we were able to find this balance between our professional lives and our personal lives, so we had equilibrium. So I hope that's helpful.
We love to tell the story that when I was giving birth, I said, Bram, please just be there. So he stopped traveling as a consultant for 2 weeks before the due date. So that was a great concession. And then I was 2 weeks late. So
I said, can we renegotiate? She said, no.
So the day I gave birth, I'm like, okay, bye, go. But it was, so there was always like a trait, we'll make it work. We'll make it work together. And I have clients to this day who remember that month. For a consultant not to travel for a month, that was a big deal. They still remember, but it was like a partnership, and so we made the decisions together that was the win-win.
Yeah, go ahead.
Bram, I want to pick up on what you just said. You said that you felt like you never had to give anything up to be supportive. My question for both of you is, what happens when you are in a situation where you do ask somebody to give something up potentially?
Well, give me a hypothetical.
It's not a hypothetical. 8 months ago, I asked my fiance to move to Boston, and we left behind 2 very successful careers in San Francisco. He came here and was lucky to be transferred with his company, which is Accenture, so it's not as if he doesn't have opportunity. But his network and his momentum for making his own change in his career has been slowed because of making the choice to support me in this transition. And the challenge that I face is in wanting to support him and in being very supportive of his networking and his growing and learning about Boston. I wouldn't say that I go so far to say that I feel guilt, but I just wonder if you have any advice for how to be supportive when you're in that situation, when you've made an ask that you feel like potentially doesn't continue to move their career forward in the way that they envision.
Well, one of our other lessons learned is to pick a city where you both can thrive. So we're big proponents, and I'll tell you that I grew up in Boston. I thought I'd be here forever. When the opportunity came to be in London and then in Chicago, we thought we'd be in Chicago 2 years. We stayed 40 years. We both changed jobs, never at the same time. So it was a little bit yin and yang. He would change jobs, and I would support him because to build up the network, and then it would be my turn, and then I'd have another opportunity. And I might be driving an hour to the next job. So it's a lot about taking turns and being in a city and an environment where you both can thrive. You know, I turned down jobs in Atlanta that weren't going to be a win-win. He now tells me he turned down some jobs in St. Louis because there wasn't a job for both of us to thrive. So you got to pick a city where you can make it happen, but you can't hold it up to the other person. Like, oh, I moved for you, or you moved for me. You have to. It has to be supportive, but encouraging, and really the glass is half full. A can-do attitude. This is going to be fine. When we actually were in the London office together, they said to Bram, we'd like you to move to Chicago and open up the office. Oh, and if Ilene wants to come, she can come too. So I'm like, well, we weren't married then. I'm like, okay. He says, well, will you come? And I'm like, well, we got to get married on the way. He's like, all right. So, and we ended up in Chicago, and I had no friends. You know, I grew up in Boston. My friends were in Boston. They weren't in Chicago. But over the time, you couldn't get me out of Chicago today. I mean, I built up friends, but I built up friends. I always tell people that what I gave up was, besides sleep, was a big social network. And that my friends, my sister is my best friend. My roommate from Sloan is still my friend. But if I see her twice a year, she's fine with that. Those are the kind of friends. I never had dinner parties. You know, I never would cook a dinner party. That would be too much time and too much planning. So, you know, we're big movie people.
Yeah, my advice to you is spend time, for each of you to spend time with each other, thinking about how you can help each other be successful. So Ilene tells this story about when she was offered the group packaging CEO. I said, we'll take the job, we'll figure it out. And she laughs about that today. But my role wasn't to opine on whether or not she was going to be good in that job. My job in that conversation was to help her figure out how she was going to make that work and make our family life work. And over the years, I'm an enabler of her career, but her marketplace determines just how far in her career she's going to go. So as you go through this transition period, you should just recognize that it's a transition period, and both invest more in each other's success than you might ordinarily, so that you don't have the guilt that you asked him to make a sacrifice, and vice versa. He doesn't have a chip on his shoulder because he came here and uprooted himself to do something else.
But then you might pick the next city is where it's a win-win. So wherever that'll be.
So we probably have time for one or two more. Back on the top right there. No, I'm looking at you. Yes, I can't see your name tag.
I wanted to ask, you talked a lot about like setting rules and saying no. I wanted to ask, like, how early in your career, how do you feel the confidence to actually say no, or like changing the time of the meeting or those types of things?
You know, it is a good question. Some people gave me advice. Actually, I had a Sloan professor who said, wait 5 years into your career to have your first child. So that worked very well because the requests didn't come right away. But, I will tell you that in my first day at BCG, I'm big on my name. I never change my name. I'm Ilene Gordon, not Ilene Bluestein. It's another whole story. But I walked into BCG the first day, and they had Miss Gordon on my door, and I said, no, it's Ms. Gordon. So I think that you have to you don't have to wait any amount of time for what you feel is important to you. People respect it. It's all how you do it. You know, and being a kind, I'm big on the golden rule, treat other people as how you want to be treated. So it's how you ask for it. Like, do you mind if I really can't be there at 8, I could be there at 9, I have to pick up my sick mother. You know, people, that resonates. It's like, it says something about you. You're a good person if you're willing to make that trade-off. And if they say no, well, just come in late, you know, you then make your decision. But that also tells you about the people you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So I would say I wouldn't wait much.
You also get a chance, you know, when you've made the decision to go, which you're going to do earlier in your career, you're going to be inclined to say yes. You get an opportunity to do a little bit of a market test. And you get to test it with your team and test it with whomever that called the meeting and kind of say, you know, I really gave up a lot to be here today. And they say, oh, I didn't know. All of a sudden you begin to say, oh, I could have asked and I didn't. So next time around, I'm going to ask and see what happens. And then they say, sure, I can move it. And you say, geez, that was so easy. And then you begin to develop your own confidence that as long as you're being fair and as long as you're delivering value, you can ask for these kinds of favors from people, and they'll grant them to you.
And companies are really want to be flexible. I mean, that is the norm of corporate America today. You got to ask, but they're going to be flexible. And they will put in rules to help you, but it may not be exactly what you want, so you need to speak up. And what will resonate, what will make it work better. And companies want to do that. They want to be encouraging to the couple. And so they're putting in different policies, but it's up, you got to speak up. But that's why you need a supportive partner that is, you should ask, you know, you want somebody who doesn't say, oh, well, you got to be there. You want somebody who's almost going to be your advocate and make you think about it. You know, you ought to ask, because I bet they could be flexible about that. And Wednesday works just as well as Tuesday.
All right, one more question. In the back with the headphones. Yep.
You said previously that the 2 consultants in one family is too much. Mm-hmm. This is the situation that awaits for me after graduation. So
well, you know what? It works for a while. So we were consultants together at the Boston Consulting Group, and we had offices next to each other. But you know, when the travel, you know, in a client-oriented business, and I'll let you answer. You're in a service-oriented business, you have a lot less control of your calendar. So I felt that 2 consultants having no control over your schedule would be challenging. And I also felt that I didn't love consulting. You know, to me it was, you know, you give advice and then you get on the airplane. I guess now it's a little bit longer, more implementation. But I wanted to be held accountable for my strategies. So it was a combination of 2 consultants in the same family. Wasn't easy. Consulting firms are now I read the BCG studies that are being done on work-life balance and diversity. It's incredible. As alumni, we get all the emails. They want to make it possible. And so today's world may be different than it was 35 years ago. But it was a matter of being flexible, flexibility and control.
Yeah, I think you can do it for a while, and you can do it early on in your career. But, you know, it doesn't get any easier as you mature in your career. The demands on you change, but you still have a lot of demands on you that mean that you're going to make a sacrifice. And you get better balance in the family if you're not both kind of exaggerating each other, you're complementing each other. So. You know, I've always said that Ilene's the smarter of the 2 of us. She came to the conclusion first that we could only have 1 consultant in the family, and it's worked out okay.
That's because I went to MIT.
That's it. And they call you a Sloaney.
Right.
So we've reached at the end of our session. So first off, Ilene, I want to say we are super proud to count you in as an alum, and Bram, we're happy to make you an honorary alum here despite your other origins.
Thank you. Thank you.
So on behalf of all of us, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.